Hello everyone, thanks a lot for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be able to share with you a little bit of our findings working with seed dispersal networks in the Atlantic forest of Brazil. And I would like to start by acknowledging all the people that have been involved in collecting this information in the ground in the last few decades, and especially thanks to the public institutions in Brazil that have been supporting science and education. In our case, the institutions from the state of São Paulo, namely FAPESP and UNESP. So I was very lucky to be part of this huge group of people that are really passionate about seed dispersers in the tropical forests, in which we can have up to 90% of the trees relying on animals to be dispersed. This is then a very fundamental process for the maintenance of forests such as this one that you are seeing in this image, which is one of the most pristine areas actually in the Atlantic forest, one of our field sites. So to get this forest at this stage, you need to have the animals within the forest and to maintain the forest as such, and to ensure the natural regeneration and recovery from disturbance, we need to have interactions happening between the animals and plants, such as this one I'm presenting to you today, which involve the animals being able to reach the plants which have already produced their fruits, feed on them, and then move to safety sites in which the seeds are dropped, and the plants can then germinate, grow, and propagate again. So, of course, nature is a rather complex system, and here I would like to show you a little bit how we untangle such a diverse bank, as Darwin would say. So we do that by studying different processes at the time. So here, focusing on seed dispersal, we go to the field, and with appropriated methodologies, we record who is dispersing who. So once we get that information, mostly at the community level, we place that in what we call the bipartite network, in which you have two groups interacting. From here, for example, in one side, the plant species, the other side, the animal species, and the links here are telling us who disperses who. So it gives us different patterns, different network configurations, from which we can make inferences about the ecology and the evolutionary process that are structuring a given community, for example. And then we can think how this community is being maintained in a more pristine area and compare that with anthropogenic landscapes. So we are living in this planet in which almost half of the surface is already transformed by human activities, and that might get a bit worse if we still keep doing business as usual. And parallel to that land transformation, we have defaunation, which is also a worldwide phenomenon in which the fauna is vanishing from the planet, and the fauna that is remaining is not it's not random, but is directed to the smaller sized ones. So we have something that we call downsizing effect, in which the species of the Anthropocene have much smaller body mass than it used to be. And then, unfortunately, the Atlantic forest is a living lab to study such phenomena, from where we have nowadays around 12% of the regional cover remaining only, which means that we can still find some more pristine and continuous forests such as this one, but most of the landscape would look like that. So small fragments surrounded by huge matrix, mainly of monocultures and of crop plantations, sometimes livestock as well, or cattle itself, and matrix such as sugarcane, for example, which are very common in the state of São Paulo, which surprisingly can be used by wild animals to move from one fragment to another. And we also have then more harsh surroundings, such as this one, in which the fragment is indeed in this very urban area. In terms of the fauna, this is what we would expect to see in a pristine community. So this variety of shapes, color, functions. But when we go to a more disturbed area or a defaunted area, this is what we see. So a very reduced subset of the original community. What I'm presenting in the next 10 minutes or so is what's happening with seed dispersal interactions in this anthropogenic landscape at multiple scales. So to start with, at the local scale, so this is where when we analyze what's going on within each of these fragments, and I would like to call your attention here for the usefulness of networks, in which number one is our most pristine area, and this is a gradient of disturbance, so 16 is the more disturbed one, and you can clearly see, even if you don't understand anything about networks or a seed dispersal, you can see that there are chains as we move in the gradient of disturbance. So we are losing the nodes, which here are the plant and animal species, and the links, which correspond to the interactions among them. So you see there is a simplification on the network structure in the terms of the size and the interactions they have. Then, of course, you can run some network metrics and describe some basic characteristic of this system and relate, for example, with fragment area or whatever variable you are interested on. And then in this case, we have a drastic reduction on the number of species, number of interactions, and also change in some of the network descriptors as we lose area. Another approach is to look at the regional scale. Here we use what we call the meta-network approach, in which we look what's going on when we scale up these local networks. So the important point is here is what is connecting this landscape. So if you think about those smaller communities, smaller patches as having these simplified communities and simplified networks, in the larger areas with more complex networks, what I would like you to pay attention here is in these red lines, which represent the interactions that occur either in this more complex structure and in this simplified structure. So they are shared in the landscape among the fragments that are remaining. So these interactions are the ones that have higher potential to connect the landscape, and they are performed by a pairwise combination of species. In this case, bird and plant species, and these species bring with them some traits that can be of our interest, as in this case, body mass and seed diameter, which give us different functions that these species perform in the ecosystem. So in the case of the Atlantic forest, this is the structure we observe, so it's a very diverse system as expected. And what we have here is these squares representing the forest fragments, and these nodes represent the interactions. As we see, we have these clouds of nodes that represent what we call local interactions, so those that occur in a single fragment. We also have these interactions that occur in more than one fragment, as you can see following the links. Those are what we call central interactions, so the ones that are shared among fragments in the landscape. In this case, we have a very highly modular structure. So each of these studies, the study fragments correspond to a single module, and that's because of the high levels of beta diversity of species and interactions that we see in the Atlantic forest. And we also have a very poorly connected system in which only about 80% of the interactions perform this role of functionally connecting the landscape. When we take those information and relate with the traits, what we see is exactly this downsizing of traits, in which the species that are, the interactions that are persisting when we run some network descriptors at the node level, so telling us who are the most common one and who have the higher potential to connect the landscape. What we see is the persistence or the predominance of smaller bird size species and smaller seed diameter plant species or in these negative correlations. Then we can group those interactions into functional groups as well, as we did here. So we have these associations between small species and large ones. And when we relate that with the area of this fragment or the gradient of fragment area in the landscape, we see that if we follow the purple line, we see that these interactions are the ones that occur in the whole gradient of fragment area. And on the other hand, the red lines are much less common, as we could expect by the nature of these species. But the point is that when we follow the red line, we see that we need these much larger areas to start to observe these interactions. The last point I would like to bring today from our findings is the evolutionary aspect of these interactions. And here we ask how many millions of years of evolution we are losing in these scenarios of disturbance. And we did that by bringing the phylogenetic information from the interacting groups, in this case birds and plant species again, and we then calculated a metric that we called evolutionary distinctness, which gives us an idea of how unique each species is within its own clade. And then once you get these values for the birds and for the plants, we combine them in the what we call EDI. So it's the sum up of both interacting partner species. We can do that for all the interactions. So for example, considering these functional groups of the small interactions, we know from our analysis as well that the smaller bird species and the small diameter plant species tend to be more recent in their clades, so they would have their combination would result in lower values of EDI. In the other side, the larger body mass species tend to be more unique in their phylogenetic tree, so their combinations of ED would give us higher values of EDI. So because we know that defaunation is toward the larger body mass species, we can predict and we can actually calculate how many millions of years of evolutionary history we are losing when we lose such interactions. So this is exactly what we did, and we did that at different levels. Today I'm showing you just what happens at the fragment level. So again, number one is our most pristine area. As we increase the number, we increase disturbance. And in what you see here is that as we move a little bit, the index of deformation, we have these very astronomical numbers that represent the evolutionary history we are losing within each fragment as we are losing the animals and their associated interactions. So just to wrap up, what we are able to do in the Atlantic forest is to identify these two distinct groups of the vanishing interactions and the persisting interactions. And we are able to identify who they are, the traits they have, so we could infer the functions they perform in the system, and we also could relate with the genetic or evolutionary information that they bring when they occur. So with that, we are able to ask what kind of forest do we expect in the future, and to do that I brought this nice illustration from our colleagues in which they were interested on measuring and estimating the loss of carbon in the trees as we lose fauna. And as you can see in their case, they expect a much simplified community, as carbon storage is associated with the seed size and the biomass of these plants. In this case, we can take this example as well and think about the simplification of the network structures that we will have once we lose fauna. And then it comes my question, what kind of network structure do we actually want for the future? I leave it open as I move to the second part of my talk, in which the idea is really how can we make all this knowledge a bit more applied and a bit more useful for other sectors of the society that are already thinking about better ways to transform our world. In the context of this workshop, I think the main question is how do we make the dots, how do we make the connections about seed dispersal and food security? Or you can ask, why should we care about seed dispersal networks when thinking about food security? I guess that's not a trivial question, and I don't really have the full answer to you today, but I can make some associations. For example, I think the connection is not that straightforward so far, as we have when we think about the decline of pollinators worldwide, and we associate that directly with the loss of food options in our daily breakfast, for example. We don't know exactly what will happen when we lose the seed dispersers, and that might be one of the reasons. Actually, might be because we rely in just a very few number of plant species to feed most of the world population, and the seeds of those plants do not come from the forest or from the seed dispersers, but from the companies that rule the system. That's very different when we think about the variety of plant species that more traditional communities use, or indigenous communities, for example, in which most of their diet is based on different fruits, and that represent a much higher percentage of their daily intakes of calories. That's the case as well when we think about non-timber forest products and wild food that come straight from the forest. In that case, it's important to note that those plants would need the animals to complete their life cycle, as for example, the Brazilian nuts and the acai fruits. And we can in which they were able to relate the loss of the frugivores in one of the islands with the loss of the ecosystem service, as such that the recruitment and the population of the socially valued plant is actually was compromised when they lose the dispersers. And this is important because this species is used to generate profits and to generate actually food for the local farmers. Another important aspect to consider is biodiversity and the importance of biodiversity to ensure a affordable and nutritious food for everyone on the planet. And in that sense, it's also important to consider the genetic biodiversity, which will make the system more resilient to climate change and outbreaks of disease, for example. In that context, I think engineering multifunctional landscapes would be a way forward, in a way that can include seed dispersal as a free service in this account, and potentially a win-win interaction for multiple stakeholders. I think in that sense, on meta networks and local networks, of course, when we have these, for example, agroforest system or small farms that are included in a landscape in which we can make predictions about the structure they would hold based on our knowledge so far. So you can expect that smaller fragments would have more simplified network structures, larger fragments would have, or larger agroforests would have more complex network structures. So the question is, does it matter for the productivity and the profits of the local farmers? The network structure in which it is embedded, the connectivity of this network, does it matter? Does it make it better for the people that are involved in these system productions? So this is also an open question. And another way of using meta-networks would be when we think about ecological corridors and restoration initiatives, combining that with the sourcing dynamics that we used in the ecological theory, in which we can have about these larger areas and more complex systems as a source of interactions, a source of ecological function, and a reservoir of genetic diversity for the conservation of options, for example. And with that, my time is over, so I would like to finish. Thank you again and give you some of my directions if you'd like to reach me later on, and I am happy to make some discussions about this right now. Thank you.